Well, welcome to part 5 of the series called 180, and here's what the series is all about if you just need a quick primer to catch up with where we've been over the last month. What we're talking about is turnarounds that can happen in your life and in my life, that we're heading in directions we don't necessarily want to be in, and when we actually look at where our lives are headed, if we were to look at our final destination, we're not thrilled with it. And so what's the best way to deal with that? We believe it's to turn around, to do a 180. And so what we've been talking about are 5 turnarounds, 5 180s that you and I can do in our lives. And today, you can see you got a little keychain when you came in. It's detailing them, and the idea is we're supposed to integrate these into our lives. And these are probably things that we don't talk about a lot, so that's why we're talking about them on a Sunday morning. So we talked already about moving from suspicion, being suspicious of everything and everyone, to trust and trusting people, moving from a place of blame where our instinct is just to blame other people, blame our spouse, blame our family, blame the boss, blame the system, blame the government, to taking responsibility for our actions and our mistakes and what that looks like. Last time we talked about moving from guilt, doing everything out of a motivation of guilt, to a place of gratitude where we would actually be grateful. And we met a woman who just showed incredible gratitude to Jesus because she understood what it was to be forgiven. And then next week, you can see the last one is about moving from formal to personal. And we're going to be talking about what it means to have a formal or distant relationship with God, to having a personal and intimate relationship to God. And you can guess then, by process of elimination, today we're talking about moving from a place of indifference to a place of compassion. And again, why I'm excited about talking about these things is I'm not sure we would normally talk about this stuff. Like if you made a list of New Year's resolutions or personal changes you wanted to make, probably none of these would be on there, but we think that these are things that can turn a key, that they could throw like a power switch on in your life, and the lights will come on in so many other areas of your life if you can handle these, because the Bible talks about these, God talks about these. So what do we mean by indifference to compassion? Well, we'll start simply by saying this. You will discover, I'll discover, that if we were to sit down and have a conversation, we are passionate about different things and we feel compassion toward different things. So, for example, if you're at one of our campuses today and we were to go to a pet store after the service, you might be the kind of person who walks into a pet store and it's kind of like, oh, look at that little puppy. Isn't he so cute? Can we take him home? You know, you feel that. If I was with you in the pet store, I wouldn't say it, but this is what's going on in my head. It's a dog. It's probably expensive, and I want to go home. That's probably what's going on. I'm not wired that way, and some of you get that, and others of you now don't think I'm a decent human being, and that's all right, because I'm not. But you see, if we were to go to Future Shop now, that would be a different story. Because I'd be like, oh my goodness, 1080p, 50 inches, that's an LCD. Do you know that that's got a 240 hertz refresh rate? That's like 4 times the technology. Can we take it home? Like that's how I'd be feeling in Future Shop. And some of you would be like, it's a TV, it's expensive, it's going to end up in the dump. Can we go home? And I am a lesser human being, so I've already admitted that, all right? But that turns my crank, whereas I'm not really a pet person. And you would discover that. That's one of the fun points in your marriage, right? In your friendships, in your relationships. The things, it can be fun sometimes it's not fun. But the things that you're passionate about are not necessarily the things that other people are passionate about. Things other people are passionate about are not the things that you're passionate about. And you discover that. And some of that's normal and some of it's kind of fun. But what I want to talk about is sort of the darker side about what happens to our compassion. And the question of why we become indifferent and how we experience emotions. Because my guess is that you've got areas in your life where you know as a human being, you don't have to be a Christian. It's not a Christian, non-Christian thing. It's a human thing. God made us all, right? So it's just like as a person, there are moments when you feel you should be compassionate and you're not. And you don't know why that is. And I remember the very first time I sort of noticed this about myself, that this is the way human beings work, happened for me when I was in my early teenage years. I was 14 years old. And to give you a little bit of the context, at the time, I had, when I was growing up, I had 2 sets of grandparents. And my own family story is I was born in Canada, but both of my parents came over as immigrants from Holland. And my mom came over with her parents, and they were kind of our neighbors. Like where I was born on a farm, and there were two houses on the farm, and there was sort of the house where we lived and then the house where my grandparents lived. So they were literally a stone's throw away for the first 3 years of my life, and then we moved. And for the next 7 years, up until when I was 10 years old, we lived 2 doors down from my grandparents. And my grandparents on my mother's side became like a second set of parents to me. We saw them almost every day. We spent lots of time together. When my parents were busy or out of town, they needed a babysitter. Number one babysitter was my grandparents. So they became like a second set of grandparents to me. And then my dad left as a young man, so his parents were in Holland. So I was born in Canada. I knew my grandparents very, very well on my mother's side, but I didn't really know my dad's parents. I had met them twice in my life, and so I had a different kind of relationship. They were still my grandparents, but a different kind of relationship. When I was little, it's funny what you pray about when you're a kid, but right through my childhood and into my teen years, I was so close to my parents, to my sisters, to my grandparents on my mom's side, that as part of my prayer, I was very afraid of what would happen if one of them died. Emotionally to me. And so I would pray for the protection of my family, for my sisters, for my parents, and for my grandparents. And I'd pray for both of them. But, I had a little bit of intelligence as a kid, and I figured out that my grandparents would probably be the first ones to go. And I would pray all the time, Lord, just keep my grandparents safe because I love them so much and I don't want anything to happen to them. My grandparents on my mother's side were very much alive and living, a full life when I was in my teenage years. But I remember when I was at camp one summer. I was 14 years old, and I got a phone call from my parents. This is when everything was in black and white, before there were cell phones, I'm that old. So it was a real phone. I had to go into the kitchen, and I had to pick up the phone, and it was my parents. And my dad told me that his mom, my grandmother, had died in Holland that day. And I was sad. Because I had just lost a grandmother. But that was the first time in my life where I noticed that I should probably feel sadder than I was feeling. And I was sad for my dad. I cried. I was sad that I had lost a grandparent. But for whatever reason, it didn't carry the emotional impact that it would have if the grandmother that I had known had passed away. Now, we're all adults now, and you understand why that is. There's something about us that we grieve the most when we know people the best and have the deepest relationship with them. And some of that is healthy and some of that is normal. I mean, our whole society and the way we report the news and understand the news and process the news is predicated upon that, right? There could be a monsoon in the Philippines that kills 200 people, but the local news will mention that, but they'll lead with the story of the cat that needed to be rescued from the balcony. It's like, okay, now you look at that objectively, it doesn't make any sense. It's like there's a cat, especially for us non-animal people, there's a cat that needed to be rescued from the balcony, and then there's a monsoon in the Philippines, and hundreds of people died, and, it gets a footnote, it just gets a sentence, and there's not even a reporter there that we saw in the news, but there's this big 3-minute story about a cat that needed to be rescued. Well, one is local, and it's sort of our neighborhood and our thing. And so we get that, and that's the way we process news, and it's kind of weird, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's the way we do it because that's how we think as people. But I want you to imagine that there's a monsoon in the Philippines, and 200 people die. How you process that story under different conditions. First, it's just a news story. 200 people die. You don't know anybody in the Philippines. It doesn't really matter. But now imagine that somebody that you went to college with moved to the Philippines, and you think they're around Manila, but you're not 100% sure. All of a sudden, you're like, oh, yeah, whatever happened to Trevor? Is he in Manila? You couldn't remember, and you might Google it, or you might try to find out, is he okay, or establish contact with him. That's another level of emotional engagement. It's a totally different story if your 12-year-old daughter is on an exchange trip in Manila. Then all of a sudden, it was a footnote in the news, but your emotional level goes up significantly because suddenly you have a connection, you have a relationship to somebody who's there. And you'll do anything. You're on the phone, you're calling the consulate, you're calling the embassy, you're checking with your relatives, you tried her cell phone, you're texting her, you're trying to get, you want to know, and it becomes very, very important because there is a connection. One of the things I wonder about from time to time is I wonder if when we were created, before sin took a hold of my life and before it took a hold of your life and before it took a hold of world history, I wonder if we were created to care at that level about everything. I wonder if we were originally, before sin got into the picture, I wonder if we were wired, if I was as wired to care about your loss, and I might not even know your name or know your story or know your family, as I would be about a loss in my own family. I wonder if we were created with that kind of capacity. Now, I mean, psychologists would tell you, well, it's only natural. If you felt that much compassion, if you really engaged what was happening in Haiti emotionally, and some of you have, but if you were to feel the weight of the collective loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and the displacement of millions of people, you would probably collapse. And I would probably collapse. Like, I'm not sure in a sinful world that we're really wired to handle that. But I wonder if originally, before sin entered the world in the Garden of Eden, whether we were created to feel and respond and be sensitive to those things. And the point is, something's gone wrong with that system. We don't work the way we were supposed to work anymore. Now, let's take that down to the next level, and thanks for tracking so far. But what's also happened in your life, and this can happen when you're a teenager, it happens in your 20s, it happens when you're dating, happens when you're married, happens if you're on your second marriage, or you're, after your first marriage it broke down. It happens with your kids, whether they turn out well, whether they've disappointed you. It happens in so many aspects of our lives. At work, where you start to get into the fray of human relationships, and you start to get betrayed, and your trust gets broken, and your feelings get hurt. I mean, do you remember the first time you fell in love, if you've ever been in love? I mean, I remember my heart was absolutely full. It was absolutely open. The person that I was in love with wasn't necessarily good for me, and it wouldn't have been a good choice. But I remember when that relationship ended, I was just crushed. There was like a level of disappointment and letdown that was huge. And then the next relationship, you're a little bit more guarded, a little bit more like, oh, got to watch that, got to guard that heart. And you get into a series of that into your 20s and into your 30s and then into the rest of your life. And something can start to play with your ability to become compassionate and to respond. Because when you get hurt, when I get hurt, a little wall gets built up. And our hearts, and some of this is healthy, but some of it is actually not healthy, our hearts get a little bit guarded. They get a little more suspicious. This is what we talked about in the first thing, trust is suspicion. You get a little more suspicious. Why do you get suspicious? Because people lied to you. Because people you trusted let you down. Because somebody said they would do something and they didn't. Because somebody was cruel to you. Because somebody didn't care about your feelings, and in the process of not caring about your feelings, they hurt you. And that not only for most of us happens once or twice, it happens multiple times. It happens in little ways. It happens in huge ways. And what can happen over time is your heart doesn't work in the way it's supposed to work. In fact, it can express itself in different ways. There are certain people, or maybe even certain categories of people, that you've just stopped trusting and stopped loving, and you could say, I've become indifferent to them. I just don't care anymore. And it could be somebody you used to work with. It could be an ex-spouse. It could be a child who's really disappointed you and now is on their own, and it's like, oh, I can't really feel that anymore. I'm just indifferent to them. So if something happens to them, I don't really care. So if something happens to my old boss or my current boss or, the guy I used to work with, I don't really care anymore. If something happens that happens to the folks at that company, I don't really care anymore. You just become indifferent to certain categories of people because they've hurt you in the past. Or, and some of you are there, some of you have moved to this place. You've been hurt and you've been frustrated so many times that your heart kind of doesn't work in a general sense anymore. We were created to experience the highs and feel the lows, so that when people are happy, we can be happy with them, so that when people are sad, we can mourn with them. The Bible actually speaks about that. And so that when good things happen in your life, you feel the good, and when bad things happen in your life, you experience the tragedy. And I believe in the Christian walk, God goes with you through those highs and those lows. And they can happen on a daily basis and a seasonal basis, but when somebody calls you with good news, how are you supposed to respond? You're supposed to be ecstatic with them. When somebody calls you with bad news, you want to be able to mourn with them. But what happens when your heart gets hurt and your heart gets jaded is you don't really feel the highs anymore and you don't really feel the lows anymore. Your emotional trajectory becomes like a long drive through Saskatchewan. It's just kind of like this. It's just flat. So you're not happy when people are happy. You're not even happy when you're supposed to be happy. You're not sad when you're supposed to be sad. You just don't feel anything anymore. And if we were to sit down and have a conversation over lunch or over coffee, most of us would probably discover we fall into one of those two categories. Either there are certain people or certain categories of people or certain events that we just block out, and we don't do it on purpose. It's just like we just don't feel anything for her anymore. We don't feel anything for him. We don't feel anything for them. We don't get moved when we see stories of orphans anymore because, well, I don't really know why, but I just don't care about that stuff, and that's okay. And we don't think about this consciously. It just kind of happens. So for some of us, it happens in categories. For others among us, it's just a general response. We don't care about anything. We don't even experience the highs and lows in our marriage anymore. We don't experience, and that can lead to a very dangerous place. It can lead to a place where not only are we not experiencing, but we're not treating people the way we ought to treat them anymore because we can't engage with them. Sometimes if you've been hurt, and particularly if you work in the category area of this, it's like, well, I don't really, have a soft spot for him anymore. I don't have a soft spot for her. And then it's not only the people who hurt you sometimes that fit into these categories. Sometimes it's also the people you don't even know, but they remind you of somebody that you used to know, or they're kind of like that person, so you don't really care about that person anymore. What happens is, in order to justify your position, you feel a sense of superiority to them. You feel a sense that, well, I wouldn't have done that in that circumstance, or if only they hadn't, that gets in a little bit to blame and responsibility, right? Well, I'm just justifying myself. You see, yeah, well, the reason that I don't care about them, or the reason I don't, but the bottom line is, your heart doesn't work anymore the way it was designed to work. And if you're in that situation, and I would imagine, some of you it may not be an issue, but I imagine for most of us, and for me, you found yourself in that place where you're just realizing, this is something I should be feeling. I'm not feeling it. And you can go through whole seasons of your life where you just don't feel anymore. Or if you do feel, it never flows in the positive direction. It always flows in the negative direction. So suddenly, the guy who cuts you off in traffic becomes the subject of all your anger and all your frustration, and maybe he should, or maybe not. But you're just angry, you're mad, and that's really all you can feel, but you don't feel compassion. You don't care about him as a person. You've stopped caring about her as a person. You've stopped caring about the people at work. You've stopped thinking about that part of the family. You just don't care. And then you get to a point where you're not sure how to bring it back. There was a season in your life where you could recalibrate. It's like, oof, okay. Whew, I'm feeling compassion again. That's good. But some of you got into the place where you just don't feel it anymore. For that person or that category of people or those situations, or you just don't feel it at all. And the compassion is gone. And long term, that's really problematic because compassion fuels passion. See, if you start to feel empathy for somebody, you will get passionate about helping that person or being there for that person or listening to that person. And if you don't feel compassion toward them, if you don't feel compassion to the situation in Haiti, you're not going to give to it. If you don't feel compassion for what's going on in somebody's life, you're not going to return their phone calls, or you will, but you'll just listen. Yeah, but it won't move you. And soon you'll live a passionless life because your compassion fuels your passion. And if you get in that place, and most of us are in the place where in some area of our life or all of our life, we just don't feel compassion anymore, your passion's going out long term, and you will get to a point where you can't get that back. Or you don't know how to get that back. So how does that happen? How do you get that back? Well, I'm so grateful for the Bible, and I'm so grateful for a God who explains so much about how we work and how he works. You remember at the very beginning I said, I wonder if in the beginning of time, Adam and Eve, Genesis, the whole dawn of humanity, whether God created us to feel and to be able to respond to everything around us. And I don't know what concept of God you have. I don't know whether you consider yourself a follower of Jesus or not yet a follower of Jesus or Christian or, whatever. I don't know where you're at spiritually. All of us have a concept of God. And just because you're a Christian, just because you're a Christ follower, doesn't mean your concept of God is accurate. In fact, sometimes the more time you spend in the church, the less accurate your perception of God can become. And that's why I'm so grateful for the Bible. Because I never really knew this about God, even though we had some, great parents and great church growing up. My concept of God was out of whack. And as I started to read the Bible as an adult, I began to realize, wow, God is very emotional. In fact, some of the passages in the Bible that probably surprise you, frustrate you, anger you, maybe even make you not want to believe in God, are one of the reasons you should believe in God. God is very emotional. In fact, you go 6 chapters in the Bible and you can see that God is already grieving his creation of humanity. He looks at the mess that freedom has got us into, and it says in Genesis chapter 6, God's heart was grieved. He was grieved. He was sorry that he had made humanity. It's like, wow, God experiences emotions. There's that part of the Bible, sort of at the end of the Old Testament, before you get to the New Testament, the part about Jesus, called the prophets, all the strange names like Habakkuk and Zephaniah. I mean, it's just like, woo, don't really read that stuff. But when you do read it, my goodness, God gets very emotional. He gets very joyful. He gets very angry. He moves between those emotions, and some of you get very scared when you read that stuff. But that is the sign of a God who's in love with humanity. That's the sign of a God who has not become indifferent. That's a sign of a God who kept loving and kept his heart open even when our hearts started to get closed. Then you move into the New Testament, you see the stories about Jesus. It gets quite interesting. The New Testament was written in Greek. That was the common language of first century ancient Near East and Palestine. And so it's not written in English, so sometimes you have fun with translation, right? But the stories about Jesus are quite fascinating. In one of the miracle stories, some of you will remember this, he heals a guy with a withered hand. And there were some religious officials standing there looking on, and they disapproved of the miracle because it happened on the Sabbath, a day where no work was supposed to be done. And so it says that Jesus was disturbed or Jesus was angry in our English. Do you know what the Greek verb actually means? It's kind of fun. Jesus snorted with anger. That's not in your children's Bible, is it? It's kind of interesting. So Jesus was snorting with anger. He was really frustrated at the religious officials. Another time it said Jesus had compassion on the crowds. You know what it literally means? His bowels twisted. Really? Well, yeah, that's edited out. But anyway, so his bowels twisted. What do you mean? Well, the bowels were seen in first century Palestine as the seat of the emotions. So we talk about the heart as the seat of the emotions, right? It's that broke my heart. They would just speak about it differently. It would be the equivalent of saying your stomach was in knots. That's how Jesus felt. He really felt. And I want to take you into a story, a chapter from the end of Jesus' life. It's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23. We're going to look at a few verses, and Jesus is at the end of his life. He's being led away to his crucifixion. And I think what happens and the way he responds to what's happening gives us a window into the character of God and what God is like. And so we're going to, if you have your Bibles, you can open them to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23. We're going to start reading, and we're just going to read selected verses. Some of you know this story. Some of you, this is new. It's all right. We're going to see sort of the last hours of Jesus' life as he gets led away for crucifixion. Now, crucifixion was a common form of capital punishment in first century Palestine. It's easy for us in this culture to think the cross is really only something that happened to Jesus. No, it happened every day. And it was basically the electric chair or the lethal injection needle of first century Palestine. And so if a criminal was caught, capital punishment was very common in those days, and every day people would be executed outside of any city in Roman rule, and they would be crucified. So it was like going to death, being on death row and being put in the electric chair, only much more common. So Jesus has had a trial already. The trial, by the way, has not been fair. If you know anything about first century justice, it was rigged. Jesus really didn't do anything wrong. The Bible would say that. If even you don't believe that, you look at the Bible, you go, you know what? He really didn't commit a crime, but he was condemned anyway. And so we pick up the story there as Jesus is being marched to his execution, and we'll pick it up at verse 26. As they led Jesus away, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, which is actually in Africa, modern-day Tripoli, happened to be coming from the countryside. Next verse. The soldiers seized him. See, you could do that in those days. The soldiers seized him and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. So because the Romans were the superpower of the day, they could do whatever they wanted. And the government was even a little more powerful then than it was now. So a Roman soldier, if they wanted to impress you into service, would just basically put the flat end of the blade of their sword on your shoulder. And they would say, you come with me, and you would do whatever they said or face death. So Simon got impressed into service, and he had to carry Jesus' cross. Now, it was customary because the purpose of execution was as much deterrent as it was punishment of the crime. Executions were done publicly. So if you were going to be executed, you would have to carry your cross, and you'd have to carry it around the town, around the community, out to the hill where you were going to be crucified. And you would do that as much to send a message to the community as in, hey, if you do what this guy did, this is where you're going to end up. It was a deterrent. Now, Jesus, and so they would make the criminals do that, so everybody would look and everyone would see and everyone would learn, and then you wouldn't do what that criminal did, or you would meet his end. Now, the criminal would normally do that. Jesus was pretty depleted physically by the end of his life. He'd been up the whole night before. He had probably been fasting as well as praying. So his physical energy was not all that strong. So if a criminal couldn't physically carry the cross, then they would give it to somebody else. So in this case, it was Simon of Cyrene. Verse 27. A large crowd trailed behind, including many grief-stricken women. Again, it was a public event. We'll skip down to verse 32. Two others, both criminals, were led out to be executed with him. Once again, there was nothing unusual about this because criminals got executed by crucifixion on a cross every day. So Jesus, as far as everybody else was concerned, was just another common criminal on death row. So, verse 33. When they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. Now, to that point, this is completely unremarkable. If you hadn't been following who Jesus, was or who people thought he was, it was just the ordinary crucifixion of an ordinary criminal. But I believe something very extraordinary was going on in that moment. And I want you, if you would, just for a moment, to imagine how you would feel if you were Jesus at that moment. See, you get upset, I get indignant, I get angry, I get offended, I get hurt, but I'm sinful, right? So sometimes when you hurt me, it's as much my fault as it is your fault. When you look at Jesus' life, I believe he led a sinless life, a perfect life. Now, sinless does not mean you never get angry. Jesus got angry. But sinless means that you just don't sin. You're not angry for unjust reasons. And he led a very pure life. And so I want you to imagine how you would feel if you were Jesus in this moment, emotionally. The people, he's 33 years old, the people that you had just called to your side 3 years earlier, there were 12 of them, are all gone. You just invested 24/7, day and night. You ate your meals with them. You prayed with them. You taught them. They saw amazing miracles. And you said, hey, these 12, I'm pulling you close here. You're going to be my closest followers. I'm going to build the church on you, all right? And you gave them a front row seat into everything, and you never sinned. And so you're trusting these 12 to take over your legacy after you know you're going to the cross. You know you're going to be raised from the dead. So you're giving it over to them. And what happens to them? Well, Peter, your chief disciple, has just 12 hours earlier disowned you in the courtyard. Judas sold you out to the Jews and the Roman government. Wow. Everybody else fled because they were scared. You just invested selflessly your life in these people for 3 years, and they turned their backs on you? If you put all four accounts of Jesus' life and death together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's only evidence that John, the youngest disciple, maybe was at the cross. The other 11, well, Judas was dead, and the other 10 just left. Now, you've never sinned, and they did this to you. How would you be feeling? The trial that you had just gone through was a sham of justice. How would you be feeling? It's like, that wasn't even fair, and I'm going to die for this? The soldiers, when they arrested you, spit on you. They put a crown of thorns on you in mockery because people say you're the king of the Jews. People are scoffing at you, and you've never sinned. What's happening to your heart? See, if it's me, I'm angry. I'm furious. I'm feeling a lot of self-pity right now. It's like, I did everything right, they did everything wrong. Why do I have to pay the price? How come they're getting away with all of this? I don't understand that emotionally. I think I know the real estate that I would be in. Where would you be? See, that's the story, and that's the context. And that's why the next verse is so remarkable. That's why the next verse blows my mind. That's why when I'm struggling with indifference and trying to get to a place of compassion, I come back to this verse again and again and again and again, because over the years it has recalibrated me, and it's the only way that I can understand how to keep my heart open. The next verse, when you look at Jesus' whole life, and if you really want to be a serious student of this, just go ahead and read the other 23 chapters of Luke. It'll take you an hour or two. Read it, look at Jesus' conduct, look at everybody else's conduct. You know, all the crowds that followed him, they're gone. All the people he rose from the dead, they can't be found, really, at the time of the crucifixion. So he's done amazing things for thousands and thousands of people, heavily invested his life in 12. One's dead, the other betrayed him, everybody else pretty much fled away. The people who were in authority by the government that God established are treating him poorly, and now he's going to be hanging on a cross. How would you be feeling emotionally? He had every right to lash out. And now the criminals are mocking him. That's what makes the next verse so remarkable. Look at verse 34. What did Jesus say? Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." Wow. I look at that. That pierces me. You know what that is? That's the sign of a God whose heart is wide open. That's the sign of a God who said, you can kick me, you can spit on me, you can blaspheme my name, you can nail me to a cross, and I'm going to love you. Jesus is, in fact, loving the very people who are nailing him to a cross. And you would think that that love would have effect. You would think when Jesus said that, because this is what, when I do a nice thing, I like other people to do nice things too. That's just the way I'm wired. Doesn't really have a cause and effect here. Look at the next verse. So Jesus says, "Father, forgive them." Very next sentence. "And the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice." It's like, I think that shirt's worth $20. It's mine. Verse 35, the crowd watched. The leaders scoffed. "He saved others," they said. "Let him save himself, if he really is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers mocked him too by offering him a drink of sour wine. They called out to him, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." A sign was fastened to the cross above him with these words, "This is the King of the Jews." Verse 39, one of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed, "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself and us too while you're at it." Just like, wow. How do you respond to that? And that's love. What if you and I, as people, and I'll speak to those of us who know Christ for a moment. Usually Christians are known by their unforgiveness. Usually Christians are known by their judgment. Usually Christians are known by their, I'm better than you, because that's what you do to protect yourself, right? You gain attitude of superiority. It's like, those people at that company that fired me. I'm better than they are. What if you just held yourself open to them? You absorb a lot of pain. What if that's why marriages go south? That's why you stop feeling stuff in your marriage? Because just, well, he said and she did, and then, well, he, and then I, and then. When people hurt me, do they really know what they're doing? No. When I hurt you, when I don't return your phone call, when I don't listen to your story the way it needs to be listened to, do I really know what I'm doing? No. I don't really know what I'm doing. And it's so hard. Because what happens to your heart and what happens to my heart is that we get so many of those little and sometimes some big incidences in our lives that it just gets smaller and smaller and more closed until we're just indifferent to it all, or indifferent to them, or indifferent to him, or indifferent to her, and we just stop caring. I remember one of the first times I faced that in leadership. It was about just over 10 years ago now, and I started off as a student pastor in 3 little churches, and they were pretty small, and they hired me because I came cheap because I was a student, and that's all they could afford. And we sat down, we tried to figure out, what do we need to grow the church? And so we decided we needed to stop making it focus just on those of us who gathered, because there weren't that many of us. And we said, isn't the Bible really for the world? Isn't Jesus really for the world? Let's build the kind of church that unchurched people would love to attend. And so we worked through that over a period of years. And at that time and in that moment, we decided the best decision would be that we would sell these 3 historic buildings and start a new church with a new name and a new place. And so we were moving to an elementary school at the time. And you can imagine that would cause some controversy and some conflict. And I was the point leader, and as a leader, you absorb a lot of that. And there was one woman in particular who was in leadership who was just furious with me, just mad all the time that I would do this, and I would take her choir away and replace it with a band and, take her building away. And she wouldn't engage me in the conflict. She wouldn't. She just, we'd sit down and she'd deny everything and know it's fine, but I would get phone calls, you know what she said, you know what she did, and you kind of just know what people are up to even if they don't tell you. And it was really hurtful, and it was a real struggle because a lot of the attacks were personal. Some of the things that were said were just not true, and I had no way of sort of, defending myself, so I just had to keep quiet, and it was frustrating. And so we did the changes, and, we got out of the buildings, and we sold them, and we moved to the elementary school, and we did all the changes, and she stopped attending. And I got a call shortly after that period that she was in hospital and she was dying. And would I go and see her? I thought, well, that's kind of like, no. I don't want to go see her. After all she said and all she did and all the conflict she's done, and you don't say that out loud as a pastor, but you just experience all that stuff like everybody does. And so I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I just thought, well, I'm going to go to the hospital and I'll go see her. So I went to the hospital and I was nervous and I didn't know what to say, and I got into the hospital room, and sure enough, she was there and she was conscious, but she was dying. So I said, so we haven't talked in about a year, and just opened up the conversation. And as I was there, it was just a moment where I realized, you know who's sitting here in the hospital room? 2 people in need of a Savior. She needs a Savior. I need a Savior. And at the foot of the cross, there's absolutely no difference between her and me. Nothing. I need salvation. She needs salvation. And this verse came to mind. Father, forgive her, because she doesn't know what she's doing. Now, I made some mistakes in the process. She made some mistakes in the process. She caused division? Yeah. Was it a problem? Yeah. Did she know what she was doing? No. So I was able to visit with her. I was able to pray with her. And she died a few weeks later. I've never forgotten that moment. And the only thing, because that incident has happened 100 times over, and it'll keep happening. And you can take it out of a ministry context, and you can put it in your home. You can put it in your marriage. One of the reasons marriages go flat is because we grow indifferent. And all those hurts and all those conversations, all those words. Father, do they know what they're doing? No. Does she know what she's saying? No. Do I know what I'm saying? No. Because if we saw that, if we saw the cross, I wouldn't say what I just said. And you wouldn't do what you just did. And it's true at work. It's true in the neighborhood. It's true in your friendships. It's true with your kids. And God had his heart wide open the entire time. And you can spit at him, and you can kick him, and you can crucify him, and you can scoff at him, and you can laugh at him, and you can continue to not believe in him. And he will love you. Now, there's a moment at which it's too late. You die and I die. You can accept that gift or you cannot. But wherever you are in your relationships, wherever you are in your marriage, wherever you are with your kids, wherever you are at work, wherever you are with that category of people that you just don't care anymore and they just make you angry, that verse recalibrates me over and over and over again. And being completely transparent with you, I think it's the only reason my heart still manages to stay open. And it's not perfect, and I get cynical, and I get sarcastic, and I get frustrated. But the only reason that God keeps opening it up, and I'm able to keep that open, is because of that. That I have a God that I've spat on and laughed at and not believed in and betrayed. Father, forgive him. He doesn't know what he's doing. And your choice and my choice is we can live in that or we can ignore it. We can just grow more and more indifferent or we can grow more and more compassionate. Today when you walked in, you got a nail because that's what they nailed Jesus to the cross with, a nail like this. And you got a little piece of paper. And I want you to encourage you to take out that piece of paper now and also take out the pen that you got or should have gotten when you came in. Here's what I would love for you to do. I would love for you, and I'm sure you've already done this, but as you're listening to this message at our campuses, I just want to encourage you, take a moment and think about that person who you care the least about. And maybe it's anger. Maybe it's just indifference. Maybe it's just indifference. It's just like, you know what, if something happened to him, if something happened to her, I just wouldn't care. Write their name down. Maybe there's a situation. Maybe you're just like this. You're just flat about everything. It doesn't bother you when images like Haiti come up on the TV screen. It doesn't bother you that people are suffering. It doesn't bother you because your heart's just grown cold and dead. Write some of that down. Then fold it up, and after I pray, the host team's going to come. And you can keep your nail as a reminder of what we talked about today. But we have some nails up here, and what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever you don't care about and whatever you've grown indifferent toward, and we're going to nail it to the cross, because that's what Jesus did. That's what he died for. When I can't feel compassion anymore, and there are days where I can't, just remember this. And I remember that Jesus died for that. And when I start to see the person I don't care about as Jesus would see them, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing, then I can begin to care for the person as Jesus would care for them. When I can see as Jesus sees, I'll start to care as Jesus cares. And that is, truthfully, the only way I know how to stay compassionate. So let's mark this moment together. I'm going to pray, then our host team's going to come forward. The band's going to play some music. We're going to sing together, and we're going to have a couple of people come forward with your notes, and we're going to put them to the cross, and we'll pray to wrap up the service. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, this is a lot today. And just as we have this quiet moment and as we write things down right now, people we've stopped caring about that we should care about, situations and events or groups of people that we should care about but we stop caring about. And we just don't feel anything. And if we feel anything, it's just anger, hurt, betrayal, bitterness, despair. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And Lord, I know as you've enabled me to do that, my compassion returns. That woman in the hospital a decade ago could actually feel for her again. Thank you. Because you love her. And Father, help us to love people the way you love people. And to care the way you care. And thank you for forgiving us because we didn't know what we were doing. In Jesus' name, amen.